All right, so we're going to talk about the role that the federal government played during the Gilded Age. So we're talking the kind of post-Civil War era, 1865 or 1870s, 1880s, that sort of thing. So I have the start date as a compromise of 1877, and I picked that as a starting date because this is when Democrats kind of regain some of their power. Before this point, it was Reconstruction, and so the Democrats did not have control of the South because the Republican-controlled federal government was had the military in the South, in the southern states, to make sure that they were enforcing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But with the Compromise of 1877, the South, the military pulled out of the South, and so the South was able to kind of get back to how it was in a lot of ways, which means the Democrats regained control of the South. So, and this is a starting date because then at that point we really have back to the two-party system, where we've kind of moved on a little bit from the issues of the Civil War and kind of looking at kind of some other things and focusing on kind of industrialization, that sort of thing. But we have kind of the two-party system is kind of back at this point. All right. So in terms of what was happening, this time period is marked. We have two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. So overall, though, politically, the country is divided. It's a pretty partisan time that people vote. If you were a Democrat, you voted for only Democrats, or people voted only for Republicans. It was pretty much one or the other. There was not a lot of cross-ticket balloting here. This was marked by an era of high voter turnout. Think about the political machines of the cities that we've talked about and how those political machines got the vote out in those big cities. And with Democrats and Republicans, there wasn't too much difference in their ideas about things. They had a lot of pretty basically similar ideas, especially about the role of business, the laissez-faire kind of attitudes. But it did kind of depend on your region. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And this time period was marked by a period of close presidential elections. And also, the presidents that were elected during this time were not very significant. These are kind of an era of kind of forgotten presidents because they didn't have a lot of power. They were mostly symbolic. Okay, so Democrats of this time were mostly white Southerners. And so that was a big constituency of the Democrats. You also had Catholics and immigrants and kind of poorer workers. These were in the cities, so white Southerners were in the kind of rural areas in the South. Then in northern cities, you had the Catholics, immigrants, and kind of poorer workers voting Democrat, in part due to the political machines like Tammany Hall in New York with Boss Tweed and stuff. And they tended to control the House of Representatives. Remember, the House of Representatives is they are elected every 2 years, and each state has a variety of different members of the House because it's based on population. So these are smaller local elections, and those are controlled by Democrats. On the other hand, the Republicans tended to be their support is mostly in the North as opposed to the Democrats. African Americans were strongly Republican because they associated the Republican Party with people like Lincoln, who worked to end slavery, so they were loyal to the Republican Party. You tended to have Protestants, not Catholics. And this tended to be the middle class for that support the Republican Party. They had some money. Now, some ideas of the Republican Party, they tended to favor restriction on immigration because remember, the class of people, they're middle class, they're Protestant, so they're going to be opposed to these new immigrants that are coming in that tend to be Catholic and poor. They also favored temperance. And, these upset groups like Catholics and immigrants because obviously immigrants don't want immigration restrictions. And temperance, this is seen as a way to kind of persecute Catholics. Think about the Irish in association with alcohol, that sort of thing. And the Republicans controlled the Senate. Now, the Senate was set up to have longer terms, 6-year terms, and was regarded as kind of the higher office than a House. And these are chosen statewide. They were not directly elected by the people. What would happen is the state legislatures, the people who worked in state government, they would pick the senators. So it's a little more kind of an elitist group here. So that's kind of the Republican Party of the time. They also tended to favor higher tariffs. Remember, tariffs are usually favored by business, not agriculture. So a lot of farmers in the South would oppose tariffs, right? but Republicans tended to favor higher tariffs because they were in business. All right. In terms of the president, I mentioned earlier how they're mostly symbolic. Their kind of big power was the ability to appoint people to government jobs. This is called the patronage system. It has its roots in the spoils system under Andrew Jackson. Basically, you reward your supporters and people who agree with you with government jobs, and that's a way you can kind of keep score and kind of reward people who supported you in the election. But we started to have a split here among two kinds of people. There were the stalwarts. These are people that kind of favored this patronage system of rewarding supporters with jobs. And then there were a group called the half-breeds, and they were opposed to the patronage system. They wanted to kind of reform the system a little bit, make it more based on merit and not as much based on favors. Eventually, the Pendleton Act gets passed, which is a reform to make sort of not end the patronage system, but kind of reform it and make it less dependent on that. And over time, this got stronger and stronger as more and more jobs were based on taking an exam and whether you have the skills for the job, not about who you know. And this is really passed after the assassination of James A. Garfield by somebody who claimed they were a pro-patronage person. They were a stalwart. And Garfield's vice president, who kind of took over afterwards, he kind of championed the Pendleton Act here. All right. Now, in terms of economics, which is the big part of this, you have two attempts to regulate business. So this is a time of monopolies and trusts, and there are Carnegies and Rockefellers, these very rich people that came about, and they kind of feeling that workers are being exploited. The populace felt like the farmers were being taken advantage of by business. So you have the first attempt to regulate business here with the railroad industry in 1887. It created this Interstate Commerce Commission to make sure that the railroads operated fairly. They had to publish their rates and make them public and kind of let people know what they were charging. And so this was meant to kind of make the system a little bit more fair. This is a big deal. Okay. However, the court system mostly limited its effectiveness. It was interpreted very, very narrowly, which means it was very specific for very specific circumstances. It was not broad at all. So it wasn't super effective, but it was an attempt to regulate business. The second attempt is the Sherman Antitrust Act. This kind of was an attempt to kind of be anti-monopoly, antitrust, right? To kind of promote competition among businesses. And what had happened before this is like you had some states that were regulating monopolies and other states weren't. So only 15 states were really trying, other states weren't. So that meant that monopolies would just go to these other states and they would file their papers in those states and be headquartered in those states. So it's kind of this patchwork across the country. The Sherman Antitrust Act was a way to kind of make it uniform throughout the entire country. But again, the court system kind of stepped in and really weakened it. In fact, it was not used to regulate monopolies. It was mostly used against labor unions. So it's saying that labor unions were not allowed. So the Sherman Antitrust Act was not necessarily effective at the time. Okay, and this kind of gets to this idea about laissez-faire capitalism, right? During this time, the federal government, when it comes to business, the government generally sides with business. Think about the Pullman strike with the federal troops coming in on the side of the business. And so there was not a whole lot of regulation, not a whole lot of laws that were limiting business. For the most part, government kept its hands off of business. Now, there is one kind of major contradictory characteristic here about the government kind of having a hands-off approach to things, which is the Civil War pensions, right? And a pension is money that gets paid to you after you've retired, right? So this was government payments to veterans of the Civil War, which was actually a majority of the male population at the time. So the government was actually paying money to these veterans and their families after the end of the Civil War. So that was a huge government program and was kind of a very contradictory characteristic to this kind of hands-off approach to the economy and helping people and that sort of thing. Okay, and we're going to end here with the assassination of President McKinley in 1901 and Theodore Roosevelt becoming president. And he becomes a much more active president than the presidents were during this time period. Okay, so that's the role of the federal government during the Gilded Age.